So this conversation has been going on for 400 years, and for the first 250 years, essentially, it was a conversation in which the Aboriginal peoples were dominant or were equal partners. Now, it depends on where you were. If you were in southern Ontario or Quebec, if you like, the partnership starts getting broken around 1820, because up until 1820, the defense policy of New France and Canada and British North America was entirely based on the fact that the people who were in the north could only defend this territory if the Aboriginals agreed to defend it with them. Otherwise, it was undefendable. And after the War of 1812-14, there were suddenly enough kind of people with rifles who weren't Aboriginals, and so they began to break the agreements, written or not, and no longer respect the relationship, the friendship, the conversation. But you know, if you go into the prairies, that date moves from 1820 to kind of 1870, 1875, 1880 with the Metis. Here, you know, it's somewhere around 1870. Not very long ago, you know, just over a century. And of course, if you go up north, the further you go up north, the later the date is. By the time you get to Nunavut, the Inuit are in control until kind of 1960. So they really only have to put up with the absolutely brilliant advice and control of the southern Protestants for about 30 to 40 years. And unfortunately, it wasn't long enough to destroy them, you know. You're not laughing. It's really funny in a kind of black comedy way. And the Inuit are very funny about it. They spend a lot of time up north. So this conversation went on through wave after wave of newcomers. The French, the Scots with the Hudson's Bay Company, the Loyalists, you know, 50, 60,000 Loyalists who were not English at all. They were, you know, the biggest group of Loyalists were actually German religious minorities who didn't speak English at all. And then after that, it was the Irish Catholics and the Scots Catholics. And then it was the Aboriginals who came with Joseph Brant and so on. And of course the blacks. There were more blacks who came to Canada as well than there were English. You know, you wouldn't know this the way we teach our history, because we teach our history as colonial history. So it couldn't possibly be that there were more black loyalists than there were English loyalists. We just rewrote the history to suit the late 19th century vision of an imperial world in which Canada was this happy little pink place, you know, that was essentially English, even though it was never English at all. If it was anything from Britain, it was Scots and Irish, right? But that's a whole other speech. So we had these wave after wave of new people coming, and they found here, as the Shuswap so ironically put it, they found here, basically, according to academics, 2 million First Nations. And, you know, in the beginning there were, you know, a couple of hundred French-Canadian, French. You know, you have to get into the second half of the 19th century. I think Canada is still only 1.5 million in 1848, non-Aboriginal Canada. In 1848, when we become a democracy, there's still more Aboriginals in Canada than there are newcomers. And that's just part of the fact that what was going on was a relationship. Now, of course, if you read our written history, you'd never know that. Because, of course, you know, there's Champlain, brilliant guy. I'm not criticizing him in that sense, brilliant guy. But, you know, a couple of hundred really hungry people with lice, crummy clothing, and dying of hunger, and they have no idea where they are. They think they're a couple of hundred miles from China. You know, they have no idea, they're lost. And there are 2 million Aboriginals who are living quite well in a rather complicated situation with many different nations and cultures overlapping. There are problems, there's slavery, there are wars, sure. But it's a very interesting, complex civilization which is doing very well, as opposed to the immigrants who are not doing well. Not doing well at all. But of course, when you write home, you know, if you're Champlain or you're, you know, one of the English, you write home, you don't write home and say, I am an ill-educated, poverty-stricken failure. You write home and say, sire, I am subduing the savages. I'm doing really well. You know, so we have this written history, colonial history, which is essentially a lie, because it was all about getting more funds. It's like raising money for a mining project. You know, on the Vancouver Stock Exchange in the old days. You know, you exaggerate how well you're doing. And so we built so much of our written history on the written proof coming out of, the Jesuit relations and letters written back to kings and to the Hudson's Bay Company. And it's really not what was happening at all. So they hung on and they gradually grew, these new people. But really, for 250 to 300 years, the shaping of what Canada would become was really determined to a very great extent by Aboriginal peoples. 250 years out of 400, 300 years out of 400, that's a long time, If you believe in any kind of idea of civilization building upon the past, that's an enormously long time for people to change the way in which they did things, to think about how to relate to each other differently, to believe that they were in a place that would function in a way which was appropriate to this place. Now, not much of that got converted into a formal recognition that that was what was happening, partly because we had to continually, people like me, had to continually report differently about what was happening here. But you can find a lot of documentation where that's admitted to, where that's said. It's just that as you move on into the late 19th century, all of that is swept under the carpet, or that's whitewashed over and made to disappear, which is why the chiefs speak the way they do to Laurier, because they're trying to remind Laurier and the government of Canada about how it really happened, how it really worked. What is at that point, by 1910, being totally denied by the Canadian system. And they were right. Laurier could have been a really interesting ally, but he was out of power pretty fast. And so that wasn't the way in which things started to get better. The conversation was really about how were the Europeans and the newcomers from elsewhere, how are they going to adapt to live here? How are they going to survive here? So part of that conversation was utilitarian. It was about clothing and food and how to get through the winters without losing your teeth and your hair and getting pimples and dying of scurvy. And the stuff as basic as that, right? I mean, the British Navy was so sort of, I don't know what the right insult is, dorky or something like that. That all that stuff about those brave British explorers going through the Arctic, dying in the ice. Well, of course, all of them had been advised endlessly by the Inuit, the Metis, the Dene, Coureurs de Bois, that all they had to do was eat raw meat. If you eat raw meat, you survive the winter. But of course, they were gentlemen. And gentlemen didn't eat raw meat. They ate boiled meat, so they died. Really, it was pretty simple. That's why I say they were really not very bright. The idea that today your taxpayers' money is being used to look for Franklin's ships is just appalling to me. Why would you want to know where Franklin's ships were? He was one of the most appalling failures of leadership that ever existed. He had advice endlessly, which he ignored, and got his whole crew killed and lost his ships. This is important to Canada? This tells us something about ourselves? Why would we want to spend our money on finding his ships? Does it tell us anything about why we should have sovereignty in the Arctic? We would be far better to be putting that money into supporting examinations of, for example, the oral history of the Inuit idea of the law of the sea, or into education, creating universities in the Arctic. There's a way to spend money in the Arctic if you really want to believe in Canadian sovereignty. Set some universities up in the Arctic. We're the only circumpolar country, you know that, you realize, we're the only circumpolar country, and we're the biggest with Russia, which does not have a university in the Arctic.